You're in the hands of an adolescent.
It's mystery. I don't like mysteries. Your bellyache. I gotta kill you right now.
Aye, sir.
Ladies and gentlemen, welcome back to the Warp Core Podcast. I am UrzaMaster. Joining me as always, Lord Uther and our cohort. Today we have Bodhi from out there on the shores. And gentlemen, welcome back. I'm excited to talk today about another entry in Star Trek The Original Series. Very worthy of note, very influential. Today we're going to be discussing... I love the title of this episode too. The Journey to Babel. Not Babel, as one might believe, but Babel, as it was pronounced. Gentlemen, this is certainly one that influences a lot of Star Trek canon, so I'm not going to take any more time, and I'm going to turn this over to Bodhi here for some background information and some little fun tidbits about this episode.
Thank you, UrzaMaster. Thank you, Lord Uther. And thanks to you, Trekkies, who have joined us. We are on episode 49 of Star Trek The Original Series, which means that 50 is just around the corner. We're not graying Star Trek fans yet, although we have seen graying Jedi in the green room. But you're going to want to check out all of our previous episodes. Make sure you're hitting subscribe and checking out all of our adventures from Star Trek Picard through the original crew and the Next Generation's motion picture misadventures and all sorts of strange new worlds that we have explored. You're definitely going to want to see them. Today we are going to talk to Journey to Babel or Babel or Babel. If you like to have a little Spanish flourish to it. However you say it, it aired on November 17th, 1967. We have our returning champion, Joseph Pevney, directing. And we have staff writer, sort of co-showrunner, D.C. Fontana, credited with this episode. And it's a big one, Trek fans, foundationally and otherwise. We have the first appearance of Spock's parents, Sarek and Amanda. Sarek is played by Mark Lenard, who you will remember as the Romulan captain in Balance of Terror, who matched wits with Kirk in the Enterprise. We discussed Balance of Terror and our feelings. Spoiler alert, they were good. In Warp Core 35. So again, check out that archive. We're on 49 now. Go on back a few episodes to Warp Core 35 to see how we felt as Mark Lenard played a different role, a more villainous role, if you will. In the Star Trek. But this is the role he is most associated with and will go on to play not only in this version of Trek, but also in future big screen incarnations and so forth. And he's just got that great sonorous voice. Even here in his salad days, you can hear it and it just gives you chills. Jane Wyatt, Miss Jane Wyatt, plays Amanda. And it was fascinating because the first time I saw her in the role, as many of us growing up in the 80s might have, was in 1986's Star Trek IV: The Voyage Home. And in fact, her scene with Spock on planet Vulcan, as he is sort of re-educating himself and relearning all of the basic facts that to train his mind, their exchange on that planet early in the picture, it's one of the best scenes in the film. They have a natural, easygoing mother-son bond. And this relationship between Amanda and Spock, which is further explored in the contemporary Star Trek series, Star Trek Strange New Worlds, it's always been a favorite of mine because she, again, is the human to Sarek's Vulcan. And you're always fascinated to see that duality and that schism and that split between Spock as he has to wrestle both sides of his personality. And yet you admire and respect his parents for what views they bring to the table either side. You don't critique Sarek because you understand, coming from him, he is a being of pure logic, and this is how he will always be. And you understand Amanda, taking a risk and entering into a relationship, marriage with someone of that, and being able to find that balance. You admire that Sarek can love a human wife as he does. And we get the Vulcan kiss, if you will. It's the little finger thing that they're doing there. I don't think I've ever seen that before. I mean, I've certainly seen Spock in Strange New Worlds puckering up with Nurse Chapel, but I don't think I've ever seen the finger salute that these two give. It was also weird to have her referred to as Mrs. Sarek. I'm just not. I'm just a guy who prefers a much more casual Amanda, but I think that might be too casual for Starfleet regs. But the entire episode they address her as Mrs. Sarek, and it's just kind of like oddly formal. But anyways, it's wonderful to see those two in their earliest incarnation of these essential roles. This show also has two new races, the Andorians and the Tellurites. And I certainly remember Andorians in the background of Star Trek the Motion Picture being briefed on the approaching V'ger cloud. So those guys with antennas. We also had an Andorian character memorably in the first season of Star Trek Strange New Worlds, as I recall. But here, again, new makeup, new effects, new creatures. And as I mentioned in just our past episode, Warp Core 48, we were doing a weird Father Knows Best run in the previous episode, playing the commissioner who unites with the companion. We had Eleanor Donahue. She was the daughter on that famous 1950s sitcom, and Jane Wyatt, playing Amanda in this episode, was Eleanor's mother on that show. So Star Trek meets Father Knows Best, and we're all here for it. But what we're really here for, gentlemen, and we'll get to our ideas about what we thought of this particular episode, Journey to Babel. More shuttlecraft. Goodness, I love it. Galileo. So we have back-to-back. It's almost like they unlocked the budget and said, yes, go ahead and do it. Now, it should have been a different shuttle than the Galileo, but it's obviously one of it's the A-list off-worlding vehicle, reconnaissance vehicle for NCC 1701. We also had the return. We started hearing it in Amok Time. We have that kind of 60s sitar thing happening, again, reflective of the time period. It's not as distracting as some of those comic musical stingers, the wah-wahs that UrzaMaster likes to point out, but it definitely sort of puts the show in that late 60s Austin Powers kind of frame. Dun, dun. So you always like to hear that, those little asides there. We learned that Spock had a pet teddy bear, even if it had fangs and claws, so that was adorable. We have Shirtless Kirk, which I know Lord Uther's always a fan of. We had dilithium crystals. We've secretly replaced the entire engineering department with delicious Folgers crystals, and let's see how far they get. And we have, in essence, I think one of the reasons that this show stands out, and I want Lord Uther to kind of begin sounding off on it, it's a really rich, tension-filled episode that harkens back to a big screen feature that we had in 1991, the Undiscovered Country. There's a lot of echoes and DNA in terms of diplomatic intrigue and trying to undercut and sabotage peaceful negotiations. You've got people accused of murder, a murder most foul. And you also have a very weird edit where we come out of like a dialogue sequence and then suddenly Kirk is swinging fisticuffs in the corridor with an Andoran. I actually really like it. It's a very abrupt cut, but it is very jarring to like suddenly you have this moment of reflection on the bridge or something between two characters. perhaps it was Spock and Amanda, and then suddenly, action Kirk, and actually a pretty well choreographed fight scene. Sometimes they get a little awkward in the staging and the blocking, but in this one, there was tension. Yes, the Andorran, he got a little stabby, and so forth. So, and you have McCoy operating under great duress again. I think this might be the first time we've seen it where he's trying to perform miracle surgery while the photon torpedoes and phasers are raising the ship and causing everything to shake violently. But actually, the big dramatic concern is how Spock handles his role in all of this. And that's really where the show's humanity comes forth. And I'm sure Lord Uther has some notes on that in terms of an almost impossible choice, a Star Trekian choice, if you will, between what is Spock's greater duty in this, and why is it important that the Andorian stabs Kirk in the first place? Is it I must protect the ship, or I have an obligation to family blood? And that is just a fascinating hook on which to hang an episode. And so, what do you say, Lord Uther? What were your notes on Journey to Babel?
No stuntman needed for William Shatner in this one. He had it all down pat. Yeah, I think that's the classic question, right? Which comes first? And I think what elevates, and we've seen this before, correct me if I'm wrong, in Next Generation, where Counselor Troy is trying to get promoted up, and she's got to make that decision to send Geordi to his death to save the ship. And we're seeing this again, right? What are you going to choose? Well, a similar idea of, does the ship come before any kind of personal thoughts or involvement? And to me, Spock does make the right decision. Now, of course, Kirk finds a way around it, which is one of the reasons why we love Kirk, right? Even though he's in a styrofoam bandage across his chest that is supposedly healing his wound, which I thought was lower down on him, but whatevs. We'll figure that out. So I love the classic, which one comes first, and Spock makes the logical choice. The needs of the many outweigh the needs of the few, or the one.
Or the dad, yeah.
Here, and here we see that. Loved how Kirk decided that he was going to come up with this plan to trick Spock and get him off of the bridge, and then Scotty will take over. It'll be fine, and then I'll come right back down. And then obviously the ship gets into an entanglement, and we're off to the races here. One more thing I got to talk about real quick. Speaking of fight scenes, when the spy is in the brig, and he just... The one guy's like patting him down, the other guy's got the phaser. The way the spy turns around in super slow motion and then swings at the security guy's arms and pretty much misses. But man, that guy went down quick. And then they hit him with the phaser. That cracked me up. And Sarek, he must have been in the gym, because that Tellurite goes for him, and all he does is this and barely touches the guy, and he goes flying against the wall. So those Vulcans and their superhuman strength are pretty amazing. Great episode, pure Trek. And what makes you fall in love with? Like, again, if we were talking about episodes we would want to show to someone to get them involved in the series, I think that this would be one of those episodes, for sure. So UrzaMaster, as always, talk to me.
He's got thoughts.
This is the episode, man. This is what it's all about. I mean, from top to bottom, you see Sarek walk in. It's all very pro. You know, they're kind of complaining about their dress-up uniforms and how uncomfortable they are. And then, you know, they're like, we'll have Mr. Spock show you around the ship. And Sarek's like, I would prefer another. And then they discover, like, oh, yeah, by the way, these are my parents. Spock hasn't mentioned this, like, whatsoever. Kirk's like, Spock. What? Like, just, you know, one of those moments is just so classic Trek. And, you know, the humor in this episode is just, I mean, it's something to write home about. Like, the idea of, you know, everybody trying to razz Spock for being part human, and then Sarek's like, you need to treat Spock with respect. He's a Starfleet officer. And yet, like, he's only really telling his wife to do this, but clearly McCoy and Kirk are, like, on him. And McCoy, at least, is not a superior officer, but no talking to from Dad about that one. But I find very interesting here is that this is also the first time the Orion Syndicate is mentioned.
Yeah.
At the end of the episode, when they discover that the quote-unquote Andorian is actually an Orion, and this was all a suicide mission to start a war so that the Orion Syndicate could profit over both sides. You want to talk about inventing some Star Trek lore. I mean, this is really setting up. I mean, the Orions show up all the way up through Picard. They're in Strange New Worlds. I mean, they're definitely influential. And you think about how pervasive Star Trek is, and Starfleet. I don't think the Orions, like, hardly ever get mentioned, but they're always sort of this dark underbelly force that just exists. We get to know them a lot in DS9. We get to brush up with them in Picard quite a bit. They're always there. And there's always this sort of sinister urge that they lean into. And you discover that it was as bright as the Starfleet is and the Federation of planets, there's always organized crime. It's sort of unavoidable. And I think in a way, with the beauty of Sarek and his logic is that you really can't avoid things like this. You have to just kind of do the right thing, and that's why they're trying to protect this world. That's why he's voting for their admission, because he knows that there's been raids, not just by the Orions, but by multiple parties. And you get this sort of thrust into the negotiations bit that Kirk is really desperately trying to avoid being, a negotiator here, despite the fact that he will negotiate with a god anytime. And of course, we get shades that foreshadow Star Trek VI, the undiscovered country. Not just Sarek and Spock and Kirk not wanting to be a negotiator, and the subterfuge that is the Orions that, could be any party. And you don't know exactly who's trying to start what. They even, name the Klingons. They talk about the Romulans. You don't really know. And the fact of the matter is, you've got your big traditional villains out there, but it doesn't always have to be the Borg. It doesn't always have to be the Klingons or the Romulans. There are plenty of other options to choose from. And this is the one thing I think that Picard Season 3 did extraordinarily well, is it leveraged all of that intrigue to really kind of misdirect you. And I think we talked about this in a prior Warp Core for sure. Even though it ended up being the Borg, spoiler alert, it gave you enough that you really didn't know. And that was the same thing this episode did here. And I think this just speaks to, again, the tremendous writing we talk about all the time, is that, the main story, the main plot of this really has nothing to do with the sub-arc, which is the, direct mortal threat to the Enterprise. But the main arc is just as compelling a human story, even though it's between Spock and Sarek, who are, insulted if you accuse them of being at all human. And you get a very, shall we say, enlightened and modern husband and wife interaction between Sarek and Amanda. I mean, I don't know that I've ever seen a more modern husband and wife take than what we see here. A wife that isn't afraid to go after the husband and, sort of set him in line, and a husband who sort of gets it but has to be a man, but also owns up to the fact that, okay, yeah, no, you're right too. That's, for 1960s, late 1960s, that's pretty incredible. We don't really see that in television until Cheers, maybe? I mean, it's a long time before sort of these enlightened views on husband and wife, or relationships between men and women, develop. So this is probably a fairly groundbreaking moment for TV. Let alone the fact that, I don't know how old Mark Lenard was in this episode, I think he's about the same age as the rest of the cast. He might be a little older, but they certainly do a great job with effects work of making him look comparably older to Spock, even though the actors, I think, were pretty comparable. I don't know the exact dates of birth. I could Google it, I'm sure, but that's something that it's always a struggle to try and age cast, and everybody had to be young and beautiful except for Harry Mudd for some reason back in the day. But even Amanda, like, you can tell it's just a silvery wig. Like, she's definitely much younger than she appears. And it begs the question of if Sarek is over 102.437 in Earth years, how many wives does a Vulcan have in his lifetime? I'm just curious.
That's I'm gonna go with the under on that one, because I think Vulcans are loyal and in love. So I'd say no more than a handful, just depending on, and that would probably preclude tragedy from striking one. Maybe being widowed unexpectedly along the lines there. So where the heck is Sulu? Again, it's like, these
Yes.
bridge crew, they're taking the worst, like, personal days. Uhura a couple of episodes ago, couldn't find her. Now Sulu. I mean, we've got to, Chekhov more than capably covers for him, and the nondescript bridge guy sitting next to him. But I mean, we've got an alien ship, like, zooming past the Enterprise and, unleashing phasers and photon torpedoes. I want my best helmsman, on there. Can you just imagine, like, they're like saying he's in his quarters, just like, I'm on break. Like, don't call me till Monday. I have waited weeks for this, and I am not going anywhere. Well, we're in yellow alert or red alert. Darn it, Sulu, get up here. No, you understand? This is a work-life balance. So that was interesting.
Well, hey, they woke
What's that?
they woke him up during Undiscovered Country when
That's
he
true.
was sleeping, and we had Christian Slater got him up and goes, Enterprise needs us, and then they took off or whatever. So, I mean, he should be accessible somewhere. That's a good point about not being consistent with the crew as to, I don't know if there was like a money thing with the actors, if they were on screen or something like that. I don't know if it was a budget thing, but that is a good point. Like, the consistency really wasn't there in terms of who should have probably been on the bridge.
Makes you wonder too, like, is there a specific purpose for not having Sulu on the screen? Like, did they just not write a part for him and they're like, well, we don't want to waste a main character on just like one line or a supporting like background. But even at that, like, we see that pretty frequently in Star Trek, like, Yeoman Rand or Nurse Chapel, who again, Majel Barrett does an amazing job in this episode. Always glad to see her on screen. I don't know. I wonder about things like that, but it also begs the question, like, how many crew people rotate into these shifts? Like, we always see like the main crew work the day shift on Next Generation, then there's a night shift. And I think Lower Decks probably has touched on this too, where it's like, oh, it's the night shift crew. We don't have to worry about them wondering where a shuttlecraft went. Like, there's so many questions I have here about that. Like, did they just have different rotating shifts, or was there some sort of shore leave arrangement? And if so, and Sulu's on shore leave, where does Sulu go? Like, I was wonder about that. Like, is Sulu, off at the shooting range? As we see in Shore Leave? Like, is that the implication? Is that he's out shooting 6-shooters? There's no holodeck, so it's like he's got to physically go on vacation. So I don't know. I think that's an interesting question. But how about the blood type T negative being rare even for Vulcans, and then not having like a synthetic, blood, replicator or anything like that. That to me was kind of striking. Like, of all the things that they have in the future, they have an onboard blood bank. with Vulcan blood, no less. But, you know, the rarer blood types, it's like you don't have a way to synthesize this, or you don't have a backup plan or a bypass machine of somehow that could, like, help facilitate that. Just an experimental drug that may or may not work, that they sort of just drop and don't bring up again. Like, we're just supposed to accept that it worked, great.
I think sort of my final closing note on the Spock-Sarek dilemma. I think we can all speak as to people in committed, healthy relationships, and some of us family men and so forth. I think if you put the choice in front of us, if we were in our own Star Trek episode, God willing, I think we would want to do what Spock does, or what Special Agent Dale Cooper might choose in Twin Peaks, like that unimpeachable integrity and like always making the right choice, if you will. But I think if we thought about it in real terms and not Hollywood script writing terms, I think our first impulse would be to protect our families, right? If our wives were in a car accident and et cetera, and we had to make the choice between, you know, job responsibilities versus the wife in a coma, I think we would all lean heavily into the wife. I would hope. I mean, no casting aspersions on anybody's current marital status. But I just think it's interesting. Like, I love what Coop did, and I love what Spock does. I love that it wants to inspire us to be better. Not necessarily saying that choosing your family is the wrong choice or the bad choice, but I like to think that if I was given a clear-eyed view of the situation, that I would be able to see all the factors and make the appropriate judgment. But I just believe that, honestly, as human beings, we're hardwired to want to protect, obviously, those closest to us. And so I don't know if we would fall short of those aspirations and ideals in a situation like that. And I don't know that we would be wrong for doing it, honestly. I mean, I don't want to cast judgment on it, but it just shows the high stakes emotionally and thematically that the DC Fontana channels here. And that's what makes great Star Trek, right? Because it actually forces you to ask the question. And like I say, we probably all want to make the right choice. And I don't think of it in a sense of right or wrong, but I think as far as it goes, I think we would all probably want to help Sarek, right? I mean, if in that situation, and it takes Spock's, you know, cool-headed logic to say, as Uther put it, you know, needs of the many, needs of the few. So, I mean, just any last-minute thoughts on that, gentlemen? Like, do you agree with that thesis that we might lean towards family, or?
I agree. Absolutely.
Well, I think it's different, right? I mean, I would just get a son, and someone would be with my students.
Right.
Right? I think it's different when lives are on the line, because the ship, right? The lives of all those people are on the line. So I think there's different scenarios where you might ponder it differently. I'm not saying it would be an easy choice,
Right,
at all, but I think if you are, you know, again, if it's, you know, my students were supposed to learn the beginnings of World War I versus I have to save a ship of 400 people, you might have to make that choice.
What if your stub was stabbed, though, in the hallway by an Andorian? That's what I'm saying. Like, that puts you in a very difficult...
I lock the door and get my
There you go.
students up.
There you go.
Yeah.
Well, gentlemen, I think that's a great, maybe not a great segue. That is a segue. No, I agree. I think there's a lot of big decisions that are made, and this is a great DC Fontana episode that begs kind of greater moral questions, and logic versus emotion plays out very nicely here. Again, very Star Trek 6, definitely very Star Trek trope, if you will, foundational once again. So I don't know if it's going to be any surprise what my Warp Core rating is. So I'll kick off our ratings for this episode. I find Journey to Babel to be a 7 out of 7 Warp Core. Like Lord Uther said, this is the episode I would show somebody who's like, what's Star Trek all about? You know, should I watch this show? I said, well, here's 3 episodes. This is probably on that list. I think it sets up the movies very well, which I think the movies are universally digestible for folks who may not be fresh to Star Trek, or may not be familiar with Star Trek and are fresh to Star Trek. I also think that it shows the best of the relationships, including the end of the episode where we get what feels almost forced, but still feels sort of natural McCoy moment where he's like, well, I finally got the last word. And you expect that Desilu, but I guess not. But 7 out of 7 Warp Cores for me, a perfect example of Star Trek.
Yeah, I'm going to go 7 out of 7. I want to go back to the humor just real quick, because that's something I liked about this episode. Like McCoy trying to figure out the Vulcan salute, but he couldn't. And then at one point he was going to shake Sarek's hand, and then he does. I mean, that's the humor, at least that I think we enjoy a little bit more. And then, of course, at the end, you're right, they throw in some campiness. But really, the humor the other times was definitely in the flow of the show and not forced. Which, again, I think continues to build that dynamic between the three of them. Cheesy fight aside, in the brig, excellent episode, everything you want from Trek. And my other question is, I wonder if God has a copyright on the word Babel, which is why they didn't use it. But of course, the more important question is, what does God need with the starship?
I've often wondered that. I'm going to go 7 as well. In a season that has shown its fair share of highs and lows, this is definitely probably one of the peak season 2 episodes, and you can go back to our choices, our selections for our favorite first season episodes. Make sure you're checking out the archive and subscribing there, pending rebrand fans, Warp Core fans. But yes, this I could only hope that all the episodes aspire to have that balance of action, humor, poignancy, moral questions. This is the full meal, and we're very likely not to see anything even exceed that. But this does set the standard and the gold standard for Star Trek for television. And if they had just had a few less bad apples, and more Journey to Babel's, then who knows how many seasons we could have gotten out of them from NBC.
Absolutely. Well, gentlemen, we have explored Babel, and next week we will be exploring our 50th episode. So I encourage all of you who have not yet, hit that subscribe button, hit that notification button, and we will see you next time. But until then, live long and prosper.